Welcome to Chapter 35, Externalities. Back in Chapter 16, we covered the high point theoretically in the course, where we introduced the first fundamental welfare theorem of economics. And it was a remarkable result. It stated that a perfectly competitive market left all to itself allocated goods and services in a Pareto efficient manner. And what that meant, you remember, was that it was not possible to make any one economic entity in the economy better off without making at least one entity worse off. So that was the concept of Pareto efficiency. And it was a remarkable result. So it stated that basically perfectly competitive economies are fantastic, that they can't be improved upon. Now, however, at that time we mentioned that there were a number of rather stringent assumptions that were behind the first fundamental welfare theorem. And one of them, the one that's of particular interest to us today, is that there be no externalities. So today we're going to consider externalities, what they are, what their effect on consumption and welfare is, and why they might be fairly prevalent. Varian defines for us two different types of broad categories of externalities. There are externalities that deal with the consumption of goods. There are externalities that deal with the production of goods. A simplistic way that I like to think about externalities, back in the perfectly competitive section of the course, we assumed that the production and consumption of a commodity affected only two people. It affected the producer, it affected the consumer. An externality at its simplest possible level is that there is a third person who is affected by this market transaction. And Varian's two broad categories break down for us whether that third person is involved in the consumption of the good or whether that third person is involved in the production of the good, or they're affected by the production of the good. A classic illustration that I like to think of in consumption externalities was my first college roommate. So I went to the University of Denver as a 18-year-old freshman, and I knew absolutely no one. So I allowed the housing office to pick for me whoever they would as my roommate. And the University of Denver housing office, in its wisdom, picked for me this 30-year-old Korean graduate student, Mr. Kim. So Mr. Kim and I were college roommates during my first and second quarter at the University of Denver. Now, this was 1983, and views about smoking were very different in the 80s than they are today. And in fact, the rules that were in effect at that particular time, Mr. Kim could smoke in our college room, in our dorm room. And I do not smoke. So presume that smoking makes Mr. Kim better off, but Mr. Kim's smoking makes me worse off. So consider both Mr. Kim's consumption world on the left column, my consumption world on the right-hand column. Suppose that Kim and I both have $10 to spend per week on consumption goods of various sorts. Back in the 1980s, before cigarettes were taxed so heavily, cigarettes were really cheap. So honest to goodness, cigarette packs were about $1 a pack. So suppose that Mr. Kim's utility is the number of dollars that he has available to spend on other goods and services, and 4 times the square root of the number of packs of cigarettes that he smokes in that particular week. And suppose that my utility is the number of dollars that I have to spend on goods of various sort minus the number of packs that Mr. Kim smokes. Now, you will notice that Mr. Kim has quasi-linear utility. And if you remember back to our first introduction of choice back in Chapter 5, if we want to find the consumption level for someone with a quasi-linear utility function, what we need to do is set the slope of their indifference curve equal to the slope of their budget line. And that will determine the quantity of cigarettes that Mr. Kim wants to smoke. So to find the slope of Mr. Kim's indifference curve, what we know is d sub k, so the change in the vertical variable for every change in the horizontal variable c was equal to minus the ratio of the partial derivatives of utility with respect to each good. And this was the famous theorem that we developed first in chapter 4. So if I take the partial derivative of Mr. Kim's utility function with respect to packs of cigarettes, I get that in the numerator. So I take Mr. Kim's exponent on cigarettes, which is 1/2, bring it out front, multiply it by 4c, and then I decrement the exponent on cigarettes by 1. So in the numerator, I have minus 1/2 times 4c to the negative 1/2. The partial of Mr. Kim's utility with respect to another dollar to spend on other goods and services is equal to 1. So if I simplify that, the slope of Mr. Kim's indifference curve is going to be minus 2 over the square root of the number of packs of cigarettes that Kim smokes in our dorm room. The slope of Mr. Kim's budget line, you might remember, the way we found that is I took the budget equation and I rearranged it to put it in normal junior high line format. So Mr. Kim's budget equation is going to be price of cigarettes times the number of packs plus dollars to spend on other goods is equal to Mr. Kim's income. I rearrange that, and what I find is the slope of Mr. Kim's budget equation is minus the price of cigarettes over the price of $1 to spend on other goods and services. The price of $1 to spend on other goods and services is $1. So what that means is the price of Mr. Kim's budget line is minus the price of a pack of cigarettes, which is $1. So if I set the slope of Mr. Kim's budget line equal to the slope of Mr. Kim's indifference curve, I can rearrange and find that Mr. Kim smokes 4 packs of cigarettes a week, which I regret to tell you is pretty accurate, according to my recollection. So my utility is that I have $10 to spend on other goods and services, but if Mr. Kim is going to smoke 4 packs per week, my utility gets reduced by 4. Now, if every dollar I spend on other goods and services raises my utility by a level of 1, you can see that I should, in essence, be indifferent whether I spend that dollar on another consumption good for me, or I could give $1 to Mr. Kim to bribe him, in essence, to smoke 1 less packet of cigarettes. Okay. So this should set up the framework by which Mr. Kim and I could begin a negotiation over how many packs of cigarettes he smokes in the dorm room. Now, if we consider what my indifference curves would look like, so since Mr. Kim's cigarettes are to me a bad and dollars that I have to spend on other goods are a good, my indifference curves slope upward because cigarettes are bad, dollars to consume on other things are good. So if we take my initial consumption point where Kim smokes 4 packs and I have $10 to spend on other goods and services, you can see that if I were to give Mr. Kim $1 to smoke 1 packet less of cigarettes, that would be moving downward and to the left, or moving southwest from my initial consumption point at 410. So I'm moving along the existing indifference curve, and that's the area that I've highlighted in red. So as I give Kim $1 for each packet of cigarettes that he doesn't smoke starting from 4, I move along my original indifference curve. So I should be willing to give Kim this $1. Now, if on the other hand, I could give Kim something less than $1 to convince him not to smoke a packet of cigarettes, then in essence, I could jump to a higher indifference curve, right? So if it were possible for me to bribe Kim at something less than $1, I move along this red budget line, and that allows me to hit a higher indifference curve. Now, if we consider Mr. Kim's willingness to accept my offer for bribery not to smoke cigarettes, what we in essence need to know is Mr. Kim's reservation price. Remember, a reservation price is the highest price that Mr. Kim would be willing to pay for a packet of cigarettes. It's the price that leaves him indifferent between smoking a pack of cigarettes and paying the reservation price, and not smoking that last packet of cigarettes and having extra money to spend on other goods. So if we think about Mr. Kim's reservation price for the first packet of cigarettes, what I claim in this second line is that if Mr. Kim didn't smoke at all, but had his entire budget to spend on other goods and services, that level of utility must, by construction, be equal to the utility he would get from smoking one packet of cigarettes and paying his reservation price for it. So if Kim pays his reservation price, R1, for the first packet of cigarettes that he smokes, the amount of money he has left over to spend on other goods and services would be M sub K minus R1. So this equation then implicitly defines Kim's reservation price for the first packet of cigarettes. We showed back in chapter 14, we could do the math, substitute in the utility levels, and calculate Mr. Kim's reservation price. But back in chapter 14, if you recall, we found out that for quasi-linear utility, remember, quasi-linear utility is utility that is non-linear in one good and linear in the other good. Kim is quasi-linear. He's non-linear in cigarettes. He's linear in dollars to spend for other goods. So Mr. Kim's reservation price for the ith packet of cigarettes is the non-linear part of his utility function applied to the ith packet minus the non-linear part of his utility function applied to the previous packet of cigarettes. So what I can say then is Kim's utility function, his reservation price for the first packet of cigarettes would be 4 square root 1 minus 4 square root 0. So Kim would actually have been willing to pay up to $4 for the first packet of cigarettes that he smokes. And we can apply this methodology to the second, third, and fourth packet of cigarettes. And you remember this pattern that the reservation prices begin high and then they decline for subsequent packets of cigarettes. Now, Mr. Kim's minimum acceptable buyout offer is going to be equal to his net consumer surplus. So Mr. Kim's net consumer surplus is equal to his reservation price, which is his maximum willingness to pay, minus what he actually did pay for the cigarettes. And remember, Kim can buy cigarettes for $1 per pack. So what I claim then, from what I computed on the previous slide, that Mr. Kim's net consumer surplus for the first packet of cigarettes that he smokes is $3. What that means literally is that if Mr. Kim can buy a packet of cigarettes for $1 and smoke them, that makes him better off by a cash equivalent of $3. It means literally that Mr. Kim should accept nothing less than $3 to be bought out of smoking that first packet of cigarettes. The second pack of cigarettes his reservation price fell to $1.66. He paid $1 for that packet, meaning that his net consumer surplus is 66 cents. So Mr. Kim is made better off by 66 cents for the second packet of cigarettes that he smokes. He's made better off by 27 cents for the third packet and only 7 cents for the fourth packet. Now, you remember that each packet of cigarettes that Mr. Kim smokes makes me worse off by $1. So if we start with the fourth packet, you can see that smoking the fourth packet makes Kim better off by 7 cents. It makes me worse off by $1. So there's room here for Pareto improvement, right? Either one or both of us could be made better off if I were to come up with some bribe greater than 7 cents and less than $1 to, in essence, buy out that fourth packet of cigarettes. So I would pay Kim some amount greater than 7 cents and up to $1 to not smoke the fourth packet. I could do that for the fourth, the third, and the second packet, but you can see that the first pack of cigarettes makes Kim better off by $3. I would only be willing to pay up to $1 to buy out Kim, so he completely quits. So I can't get Kim to quit, but I could get him to cut back to 1 pack per week. Now, what if the rules in the dorm changed such that Mr. Kim had to obtain permission from me for each pack that he smoked? So I should be willing to accept nothing less than $1 for permission to smoke. So Mr. Kim could ask me, can I smoke 1 pack per week? And I would say, well, you have to pay me $1. And Mr. Kim, of course, is willing to pay up to his net consumer surplus. He should be willing to pay $1 for, so he has to pay $1 to the grocery store to buy the packet of cigarettes. He has to pay $1 to me for permission to smoke. Mr. Kim's net cost for his first packet of cigarettes would be $2. He has a reservation price of $4. He'd be willing to both buy the packet of cigarettes and obtain permission from me to smoke that first pack. The second pack of cigarettes, Mr. Kim would only be willing to pay up to 66 cents to obtain permission to smoke it, but I would be willing to accept nothing less than $1. So Mr. Kim would be unable to pay me enough, he would be unwilling to pay me enough to gain permission to smoke the second packet of cigarettes. So Mr. Kim can only obtain permission from me to smoke 1 pack per week. Now, you will notice that that whether Mr. Kim could smoke at will in our room and I pay him to cut back on smoking, I was able to pay him to cut back to 1 packet of cigarettes. If the rules changed such that Mr. Kim had to obtain permission from me to smoke cigarettes, Mr. Kim could only afford to obtain permission from me to smoke 1 packet of cigarettes. Regardless of the rules that were in effect, only 1 packet of cigarettes was smoked. That is no accident. It turns out that 1 packet per week is the Pareto efficient quantity of cigarettes to be smoked in our dorm room. This result is a very famous result that was first published by Ronald Coase, who was the Nobel Prize winner in economics in 1992, I believe. And Coase, in this very famous article, The Problem of Social Cost, defined what's come to be known as the Coase theorem. It says that if property rights are well defined and transaction costs are 0, then resources will be used in a Pareto efficient manner, regardless of to whom the property right is assigned. What this means, let me back that out just a second. By property rights being well defined, what I claim is that Mr. Kim and I understand which set of rules we live under. So we either both understand and accept that Mr. Kim can smoke at will, or we both understand and accept that Mr. Kim has to pay me for permission to smoke. So we have to be in one regime or the other without ambiguity. That's what we mean by property rights being well defined. Transaction costs being zero means that it is costless for Mr. Kim and I to come to a legally binding agreement over how many packets of cigarettes he's going to smoke per week. So if those conditions are met, what the Coase theorem says is that we always go to the same Pareto efficient quantity of all goods being consumed. And it doesn't matter which property rights regime that we're under. Now, it turns out that these two preconditions are frequently violated in practice. So if property rights are not well defined, then the negotiations don't take place over how many packets of cigarettes should be smoked. The negotiations would take place over which property rights regime are we operating under, right? Because surely it's better, so the person who has the property right receives the payments. So if Mr. Kim has the right to smoke, I have to pay him not to smoke. If I have the right to clean air in the room, then Mr. Kim must pay me for permission to smoke. So if property rights are not well defined, it's not clear which set of rules is in effect, then you can't negotiate over outcomes, you negotiate over property rights. Okay. And the second point, the costs of negotiating and enforcing an agreement often involve attorneys, and attorneys don't work for nothing, right? Or also, transaction costs may be non-zero if there's a large number of people involved in the externality. And we're going to have an example of that when we talk about production externalities. That's usually the case with instances of air pollution. That's a classic where millions of people are involved, and think about the complexity of coming up with a legally binding agreement that involves millions of people. It's just simply not feasible. Okay. So production externalities, these are externalities that involve not the consumption of a good like smoking cigarettes, but the actual production of a good. And we'll consider first positive production externalities. The classic example that's always talked about in textbooks or in the literature would be a fruit orchard who locates next to a beekeeper. So the bees pollinate the fruit, making the fruit more productive, a greater output of fruit, and the presence of the orchard right next to the beekeeper's hives mean that the bees produce more honey. So there's this mutually beneficial, actually there's a double positive externality. Another example I thought of, Magnolia actually bestows a positive externality on other business owners in the Waco area. So all these people who come to Waco to see the silos and eat at Magnolia table and do all the other Magnolia things have to stay somewhere. They buy food in restaurants, they stay in hotels, and all these things give a benefit to other Waco area business owners. So Varian points out to us that we actually in practice don't see very many positive externalities because there is a clear economic benefit if one entity buys out the other and run them jointly in such a way that benefit both. So we don't see many positive production externalities in practice. On the other hand, we do see plenty of negative production externalities. One classic case from law and economics was regarding the original Sun City development. So Sun City is a retirement community. If you're from Texas, you might be familiar with the one just north of Georgetown. It's very popular. Lots of old people live there. So the original Sun City was north of Phoenix. and it was unexpectedly popular. The developers made gobs and gobs of money, but it turns out that the original land that they purchased bordered a feedlot. So it bordered spur industries, and I actually was able to do, through a little internet searching, find real honest-to-goodness pictures of both. So on the right, this is a picture of a house for sale at Sun City, very pleasant. And on the left was a picture of the Lizard Acres feedlot, which was the feedlot that bordered Sun City. So retirees do not like to walk out in the morning from their home and smell cattle. Because if you live right next door to a feedlot, there's manure in the air continuously, and flies, and it's just extremely unpleasant. So the expansion of Sun City was being inhibited by the presence of the feedlot. It was a clear production externality, right? The production of cattle is a good thing, right? So if you're not vegetarian, hamburgers and steaks are a good thing. Building retirement homes is a good thing. The problem is when they're located next to each other, there's a negative externality. So if we have a more traditional cost diagram of what was going on, what we could say then is the marginal cost curve here represents the costs of producing a cow ready to go to slaughter to the packing house. These are the costs that Lizard Acres, the feedlot, actually has to pay. But there are additional costs of production that the feedlot is not responsible for. Those would be damages in reduced property value, noise, airborne manure, increased medical expenses, particularly if you have lung problems, right? All these sorts of things would be a negative externality. And suppose that the dollar equivalent of those costs is represented by this vertical distance of delta. So the marginal social cost, which I've denoted here as MSC, is equal to the private cost, the cost that Lizard Acres actually has to write a check for, plus these other costs of cattle production, delta, that the feedlot does not directly have to pay for. Now, if the feedlot is only responsible for part of the costs of production, they're going to choose in this diagram to run Y sub 0 cattle through their feedlot. But that is a Pareto inefficient quantity of cattle. The Pareto efficient quantity of cattle is Y star, where the total cost of resources used to produce the cattle, that would be the feed and the medical care, plus all the damages caused to the next door neighbors, is equal to the price of a cow that's sold in open market and ready for the packing plant. So that quantity is represented by Y star. So different mechanisms that we might have at our disposal for resolving this externality. If the feedlot has the unambiguous right to pollute, right, Sun City could pay the feedlot to cut back their production level. This would be the equivalent of Mr. Kim and I in smoking, right? This could apply to Sun City and Lizard Acres. If, on the other hand, the damages are so great relative to the amount of profits that Sun City could make, Sun City could feasibly buy out the feedlot and then simply shut it down. They could sue for damages, right? So that would be a way of forcing the feedlot to pay for the damages that are caused to the retirees. Or then we have solutions that could involve government. Government could estimate the damages. So the actual magnitude of delta is unknown. Government could estimate what delta is and then impose a tax on the production of cattle, right? the government could impose a tax of delta for each cow that was produced in this feedlot, and then the feedlot, left to itself, would choose to produce Y-star cattle. Or the government could require a permit to run a cow through the feedlot, and then they would have tradable permits, right? So they could issue only Y-star permits. They could auction permits to the general public and only allow Y-star for sale, or they could issue Y-star permits and then allow the permits to be tradable. So if you take the economics of government, which is a 4,000 level econ elective, we're going to talk about the sulfur dioxide permit trading program. And that's an implementation of this last idea that, that occurred in the US in the mid-90s. It's a very successful program. The final subject that's discussed in this chapter is the tragedy of the commons. And it was popularized first by this very famous article from 1968 written by this evolutionary biologist Garrett Hardin. And Hardin asks us to consider a quiet medieval agricultural village, and outside of this village there is a pasture that's owned by the village in common. So no one individual person owns the commons, but any resident of the village has the ability to place a cow in the commons. And hence the title of the article, The Tragedy of the Commons. What happens under this regime is that if residents of the commons can place a cattle at will into the commons, there will be chronic overgrazing. What will happen is that villagers will put too many cattle in the commons. All the cattle who are out there will be chronically underfed, on the verge of death, and we have basically social mayhem as a result of this, hence the tragedy. Now, to set up the economics of this, let F of Y be the quantity of beef produced by Y cattle. So, and suppose that the weight gain is distributed evenly over all the cattle that are in the commons. So the average product, which is the total quantity of beef produced by Y cattle, divide by Y cattle, that's the average product, but let that be the amount of beef produced per cow. So a little bit of a heroic assumption, but not too heroic. Okay? And then let C be the cost of placing a cow in the commons, and whatever that is. So under the tragedy of the commons, what will happen is that villagers will continue to place cattle into the commons until the average product, which is the amount of beef that they could gain, is greater than C, the cost of producing cattle. And what you get is what, in essence, is the perfectly competitive outcome, right? Cattle will be placed into the commons until the net gain to the last cow produced is 0. So you get Y sub 0 cattle in the commons, and you get no producer surplus, right? So no gains. The efficient quantity of cattle would be the monopoly amount. So that would be where the marginal product at Y would be, if the Yth cow is added to the commons, how much additional beef is produced. So cattle should be added into the commons until the marginal product is equal to the cost. That leads to the official quantity Q star. How could we ensure that the tragedy of the commons is resolved? There are 3 possibilities that come immediately in mind, and that's from a couple slides back. One would be privatization. Right? So remember, the whole idea of the tragedy of the commons was that no one owned the commons. Right? So There was no one person who saw both the gain of placing another cow in the commons and all the costs, as in the costs of reduced output to other villagers who already had cattle in the commons. If the commons were privatized so that one business or villager owned the commons, then it turns out that the one person who owns the commons will choose Y star because they see all the benefits and costs. Government could, so another possible solution would be government could tax each cow delta. Delta would be the difference. I mean, you can see it graphically. It's the difference between the average product and the marginal product at the efficient quantity. And that distance delta represents, in essence, the costs or the externalities that are imposed upon the other villagers who already have cattle in the commons. And finally, the government could issue Y star permits and no more. This would also avert the tragedy of the commons. Okay, to the quiz. One of the SmartWorks problems is very much like this. So rather than an airport and a housing development, I believe in SmartWorks, these were trains next to a housing development, if I remember right. So anyway, airport next to a housing development, let there be X planes and Y houses in the development. The profits of the airport are a function only of X. The profits of the housing developer are a function of the number of houses built, Y, and also the number of flights into the airport, which is X. So this last term on the developer's profit function minus XY is the externality term. So we need to figure out the number of houses to be built if a single entity owned both the airport and the housing development, or how many houses would be built if the airport and the housing development are operated independently, but the airport has to fully compensate damages that are done. Okay. So the calculations, if we have one joint company that operates both the airport and the housing development, its profit function would be the sum of the airport's profit and the housing development's profit. This new joint company chooses both the number of planes and the number of houses. So we differentiate profit with respect to airplanes, set it equal to 0, differentiate with respect to houses and set that equal to 0. Now we have two equations in two unknowns. We simply substitute one into the other and we can solve for the Pareto efficient number of airplane flights and the Pareto efficient number of houses. Okay. So under the second scenario, if the airport must compensate the housing developer, what that means is we take the housing developer's original profit function and undo the damages. So if the damages were minus XY, what that must mean is compensation is XY, that externality term is dropped, and the housing developer's new profit function is 28Y minus Y squared. The developer will choose Y to maximize this. We differentiate, set it equal to 0, solve for Y. There would be 14 houses under this regime. Okay. Second problem, Horsehead, Massachusetts. This is a tragedy of the commons problem. So the cost of operating a lobster boat is $2,000 per month. We have a total monthly revenue from the lobster boat. Okay. And we're asked to compute the number of boats if there are no restrictions versus what would be the efficient quantity where we maximize total profit. So scenario 1 is the tragedy of the commons. What we would do is we would set average product of each boat equal to the cost of running a boat in the harbor. So average product is total product divided by output. We get the expression for average product. The cost of operating a boat was $2,000 per month. This gives us 24 boats for the month. Now, if we want to find the profit maximizing quantity of boats, what we need to do is compute the marginal product. So we differentiate the total product with respect to output, set that equal to marginal cost, and we find that the profit maximizing number of boats should be 12, or half of what the free market quantity of boats would be. So that does it for chapter 35.